Hello friends, my name is JJ, and I am in Washington, D.C. right now, a city whose tourism industry revolves heavily around stuff relating to the US government, with a particular emphasis on the presidency, specifically. There are so many president-themed attractions to see: statues of presidents, temples to presidents, halls of presidents, museums full of presidential knickknacks. This parking garage was president-themed for some reason. And don't get me started on all of the presidential souvenirs. The amount of president-themed stuff you can get here is truly astonishing. Not just an endless assortment of presidential books and posters, but all manner of presidential toys and clothing and coffee mugs and puzzles and candies and Christmas ornaments and novelty bottle openers. But even once you leave Washington, there is still a lot of presidential fun to be had in America. You can visit one of the many presidential libraries or presidential birthplaces, or that farm in Virginia where the guy has giant concrete heads of all the presidents. Anyway, it all got me thinking of what a special thing the American presidency is. The presidents of the United States have become one of the country's most famous symbols, both to American and foreigner alike, at a level that feels quite unique by global standards. I mean, all countries are defined by their political leaders to some extent, but few countries seem to openly embrace and sentimentalize them and their office to the same extent as America. Forget the fact that the president of the United States has his own seal and flag and song and airplane. In a lot of places, even something as simple as a children's book about all of the country's leaders would seem sort of eccentric or gratuitous. The American tradition is not without controversy, of course. You will sometimes hear Americans complain about the cult of the presidency and how it's become way too central to everyone's understanding of American history and government, and how presidents are too revered in American culture, which allows them to amass too much power, or at the very least causes voters to have unrealistically high expectations of what a president can do.
We've grown to view the president as somebody who can get the country moving again, who can heal up the nation's wounds, teach your children well, and basically as a combination guardian angel, national nanny, and supreme warlord of the earth.
So I was thinking it might be worth exploring some of the roots of how all of this came to be. Why is the presidency of the United States such a big deal? And why don't more countries care about their leaders as much? Now, to be clear, I don't want to act like interest in a country's leaders or past leaders is entirely some weird American thing. The so-called great man theory of history, wherein you tell history primarily as a story of big decision makers like presidents or kings or prime ministers, is pretty common all over the place, as is the commemoration of great leaders with things like statues or their pictures on the money and so on. Which thus leads me to my first, and in many ways most basic theory of why the US presidency is such a big deal. America is simply a big deal. The United States has been the world's most famous and powerful country for quite some time, so it logically follows that there would be outsourced interest in the men who sit at the top of its government. After World War II, when America looked to be entering an unprecedented era of global military and economic strength, the term leader of the free world started to be used in reference to the President of the United States, and the term stuck, as did the cliche of the man with his finger on the button, in reference to America's enormous nuclear arsenal, which only the president, as commander-in-chief, can authorize the use of. So when an office is this mighty, it is only natural that there would be some degree of respect and even reverence for it, both in America and abroad. It is also the case that America is just a pretty interesting country. It is a new world colony that broke away from its European masters in a deeply ideological revolution led by a clique of high-minded philosopher types. The fact that America's first few presidents were also the intellectual architects of its revolution and some of the most important political theorists of the 18th century created a very high standard for the office right off the bat. This idea that every American president should aspire to be as great a man as Washington or Jefferson or whoever is a fairly unique byproduct of America's revolutionary history, and something that often has no equivalent in other countries where the first president or prime minister might be a completely forgettable person who wasn't all that important. I know it's a bit of a running joke in Australian culture, for instance, that no one really knows or cares who their first prime minister was, because Australian democracy was born in a vastly less grand and ambitious way. But talking of Australia, this now brings me to what I believe is the second root cause of the cult of the American presidency: America's British heritage. After the American Revolution split the United States from Great Britain, it was considered highly significant that the new country did not establish a monarchy, given that that was basically the only form of government that any country used at that time. But after a brief experiment with putting the US under a system of collective leadership, America's founding fathers did soften their opposition to the idea of one-man rule somewhat, creating a solo president who enjoyed fairly broad powers. In the way this story is usually told, this concession is the root cause of the American presidency's sort of monarchical vibe, but the reality is a bit more complicated. Even though they had come to embrace the necessity of a strong leader, the founders remained pretty explicit about not wanting a king. So what other existing political system could they take their cues from then? Well, there was one system that the Americans had actually witnessed much closer than any monarchy, and that was the rule of the British colonial governors. Colonial governors were often deeply aristocratic men, but they weren't kings. They were more modest political administrators who ruled on the king's behalf. They accordingly held a powerful office that was nevertheless a kind of softer, watered-down version of royalty, and the American presidency and the new elected American governors of the states, in turn, became a kind of watered-down version of them. A lot of American presidential traditions, like having the president live in a stately mansion where he could host banquets and balls, having him hand out medals and ribbons, and having him serve the pseudo-military role of commander-in-chief, was more or less directly lifted from stuff that Britain's colonial governors did. This is basically where the whole idea of a first lady comes from too. Because the governors of colonial America would often be the baron or duke of whatever, their wives would be the baroness or the duchess, and in the very hierarchical and deferential world of British colonial society, everyone was supposed to consider the governor's wife a big deal too, at least when it came to the womanly realm of things like social functions. When George Washington became the first president of the United States in 1789, people accordingly treated his wife Martha very much like a governor's wife, calling her Lady Washington or even the Presidentress, and expecting her to continue to host high society parties and things, a tradition that more or less continues to this day. Non-Americans sometimes like to scorn the First Lady tradition as kind of strange, but it is actually pretty common in countries with a history of British colonial rule. In countries that are still nominally under the British monarchy, like Canada or Australia or Jamaica, for instance, the wife or husband of the Governor General is still often given an official title and official duties and an official oil portrait in the official mansion and all the rest. And even in places that cut ties to the British Crown, like Ireland, still tend to treat the president's wife as some sort of important person with her own page on the website and so on. Alright, and now my third theory about why people care about American presidents so much might be the most interesting, since it has less to do with politics or intentions and more to do with the fairly arbitrary variables of tenure and timing. So the list of American presidents is quite weirdly stable by the standards of almost every other country in the world. I mean, consider this. The American presidency is fixed by law to a minimum of at least one 4-year term. And the vast majority of American presidents, over 80% of them, have managed to get through this without dying or resigning. Only one president has ever resigned at all, in fact, which is really unusual by global standards. In all of American history, there has likewise only been 2 presidents who have served for less than a year, something which is pretty common in other places. In my own lifetime, for instance, I've already seen 2 Canadian prime ministers serve for less than a year. It's also kind of interesting that for some reason, American presidents almost never run for non-consecutive terms, and only one has done so successfully. This means that there's not a lot of back and forth in America's list of presidents in the way that you sometimes see in other countries, where it is not nearly as politically taboo to seek the top job again after losing an election. Italy, for instance, has had 5 prime ministers serve non-consecutive terms since 1989, including 2 that have served a 3rd non-consecutive term, something that is completely impossible in the American system. America also hasn't had any military coups or other weird situations where the legitimacy of the presidency might have been contested or even abolished for some period, because America America is lucky enough to have never gone through a phase of dictatorship, invasion, or foreign occupation. Nope, it has just been the same office under the same constitution with an unbroken string of sequential occupants for over 230 years. This has made the presidency a fairly safe thing to like and sentimentalize as well, in the sense that while there may have been bad presidents here and there was never a situation comparable to like Germany or Chile or Norway, where you had an outright evil psychopath in the top job whose face you might not particularly want on your Christmas ornaments. It is also a fact that by a weird quirk of history, a lot of presidential terms have wound up starting very close to the beginning of a decade, which in turn means that a two-term president can wind up governing for as much as 80% of that decade. Some notable recent examples of this would be Obama for the 2010s, George W. Bush for the 2000s, and Ronald Reagan for the 1980s. If Biden wins a second term, he will be this for the 2020s as well. What all this means is that for most of American history, a president's term has been this very stable period of time that becomes easy and even fun to record as this very clean and tidy chronology that also provides a very easy way to understand American history in general. The documentarian Ken Burns has a famous sarcastic quip where he describes the traditional way of teaching American history as just a list of presidents punctuated by wars, and he's not wrong. Understanding history in this way isn't that exclusive to America, however. When countries have kings or queens, it is common to think of history as long royal reigns punctuated by wars, though this system gets a bit awkward when you get to the point where the monarchs stop mattering politically. I've noticed that when Europeans sometimes have lists of their kings in their textbooks and stuff, they just declare the reigns of the more modern kings to be the age of democracy or whatever. It doesn't have the same tidiness of the American system, where the president is always the most important political guy and the guy whose reign syncs up so nicely with significant periods of history. In fact, if we really want to double down on this thesis, there might even be a biological basis for why people like the American presidency so much. A 19th century British mathematician called Benjamin Gompertz famously calculated that a human being's statistical likelihood of death increases in 8-year intervals in what's known as the Gompertz law of human mortality. Basically, every 8 years, your likelihood of death doubles. So by the time you're 40, your likelihood of death has increased by something like 5-fold from the time you were 8. That's how the math works, right? Anyway, the point is that according to Gompertz law, witnessing a two-term American president come and go, or even just two back-to-back one-term presidents, will represent a significant decay in the quality of a person's life, particularly if you were born in a presidential election year, as I was. So in other words, why not care about presidents? In their own unique way, each one is its own special stone in our path to the grave. And on that cheery note, I'd love to hear if any of you guys have any theories of your own as to why you think American presidents are treated as such a big deal, and why, for that matter, you think the same might not be true of other countries, or maybe it is true in your country. I'd be curious to hear about other presidential cults around the world. Let me know in the comments, and I will see you next week.